Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? So we're here today to talk about sea level rise. As you all have seen, the news outlets across the nation continue to paint an ominous picture about the future of South Florida. So to my immediate, I'm going to let them introduce themselves rather than read their bios, but to my immediate left I have Jim Murley. Jim Murley is the Chief Resilience Officer for Miami-Dade County. We have Aris Papadopolous, who is the founding chair of the Resilience Action Fund and a distinguished expert in resilience at Florida International University, and Paul Handerhan, who is the senior vice president of public policy for the Florida Association of Insurance Reform. So I'm going to let each of the gentlemen introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get into sea level rise.
Well, thank you, Alex, and good morning, everyone. Welcome on behalf of Miami-Dade County government. My background is in urban planning and law, and I mostly participated and been employed in public policy positions at national level, state level, and now in the county. So I'm happy to be here with you today.
Aris.
Oh, thank you. Aris Papadopolous, try to remember that last name. You can, early morning. That fancy kind of titles is really kind of hides really what my real career was. I'm an engineer by training, and I spent my career in business. I built over 25 years a heavy construction materials company in the eastern coast. Maybe some of you see the ready-mix trucks with a Titan label on it. That's Titan America. I was CEO of the company for 20 years. I retired, I call it semi-retired, a couple years ago, to let a younger generation kind of run the business after the slump that we experienced. And I've had a strong interest in this topic of resilience and disaster prevention ever since I was in the World Trade Center 9/11. So I'm now involved with FIU. I've started a nonprofit, wrote a book. That book's being made into a documentary that PBS will air. And I have a very close interest with what happens here in South Florida since I live here, and have come to know the great people that we have. And really welcome this opportunity to speak to you, because most of you are business people, I assume, here.
Good morning. My name is Paul Handerhan, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Public Policy for FAIR. FAIR is an acronym. It stands for the Florida Association for Insurance Reform, and I do governmental advocacy at the state level and the local level.
Great, thanks. And Paul was kind enough to introduce me as Dr. Bogdanoff. If you need medical help, that's not what I do. I have a Ph.D. in oceanography, so if you need to know anything about the ocean, I can help you there. I am the co-founder of an engineering consulting firm called Brazaga. We work with developers, realtors, and local governments to help address the effects of sea level rise and kind of think about what to do long term. And so, Jim, we're going to kind of get right into it and start with you. We've heard the term resilience a lot lately, especially from Miami-Dade County and the beaches, from the 100 Rockefeller Cities project. So I'd like to start with you, let you define resilience for us, and then tell us a little bit about how Miami-Dade County views resilience.
Well, obviously the word resilience has been in the dictionary a long time. It has a meaning that we can use in everyday life, but I think what has evolved at the government level is that an expansion of what we traditionally have expected government to do at all levels is to be prepared for the unexpected, to think about emergencies and to do the planning. What we have evolved in our Miami-Dade County government is to have now an Office of Resilience within the mayor's office, which allows us to look across all the county's departments and not only build on our ethic of preparedness for hurricanes and other events that could disrupt the status quo, but to start thinking about how those things actually interchange with a lot of other issues that our diverse community is facing and is struggling with on a regular basis. Traffic congestion, housing, dealing with diseases that come from being an international crossroads, like when Zika had its impact on us a year or so ago. It's much more complicated than just getting ready for hurricane preparedness season, which is still very important, and it's June 1st, so have your own plans. But resilience is thinking about how we build into our regular investment programs at the Department of Water and Sewer. which this building and every one of us depend on to be operating every day, we're now upgrading our entire system to be thinking about being resilient to what we now know about things like sea level rise and storm surge. Those weren't factors that we considered when we built the original infrastructure. Now we're building in that so we're better prepared. And when we do have to recover from these events, which we will have to do, then we'll be better able to not just recover, but to what we kind of say is bounce forward, to do a better job in rebuilding once we experience that. That's, to us, the kind of the ethic of resilience within government. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. You know, for me, I think about resilience as prospering through adversity, getting through something that's tough, and I think that that's what we're talking about today. So how many of you have heard about king tides? How many of you heard about king tides 5, 10 years ago? Oh, so a couple of you have been aware of this for a while. So one of the things we want to tackle this morning is that sea level rise itself is really a risk augmenter. So we already have flood risk here, whether it's storm surge, heavy rainfall, groundwater inundation, or tidal flooding, which we now call king tides. What we're really doing is we're augmenting that risk. We're changing that risk because sea levels are rising. So I wanted to let the panel talk a little bit about how they view the different types of flood risk and how communities might see those risks change over time.
Want me to start?
No, I'm happy to begin that discussion. It's a big topic, and
Yep.
I mean, South Florida is a great place to live. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here with the beaches, with the good climate, with the cultural. But let's be realistic. Topographically, South Florida, I like to describe it as a sandbar and a half sitting on a sponge in a wind tunnel. And when I say the sponge, the ground that's underneath us, the Biscayne Aquifer, is actually a very permeable layer that lets water flow in both directions. And we know that we're in the wind tunnel. So when the first settlers came down here, they actually saw the reality of it, and they settled on the high ground, the ridge area that I call, kind of west of Biscayne Bay. And Flagler, when he filled the west side of Miami Beach with bay sand and mud, a couple feet, he realized after the first storm and said, damn, I should have built it higher. But then it was too late. They put some drainage, and we've gone by for the last 50, 70, 80 years, let's say, with that. But all the assumptions that we've built Miami on are changing. Okay. I mean, most of the land west, let's say, of the airport was a swamp. And the Army Corps in the 40s and 50s, yeah, they did their projects, and rainwater flooding was the big concern then, and they were able to control that, and that's how we built everything up to the Everglades. But that was based on certain assumptions too. So all these assumptions are changing, and that means all our development assumptions have to be relooked at. I like to say we're going to have to rebuild a big part of what our predecessors and ourselves built over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years. So what do we do about it? And you really, the property, the realty industry are at the forefront of this communication, because you're dealing with the consumers, whether they're commercial consumers or residential consumers or lessors or whatever. And the question is, what are you going to communicate? Or are you going to just say, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to let other people speak for me, whether that's the county or the newspapers or people overseas talking about it. But there's a huge risk in doing that. We can go on to talk about, the initiatives of what Miami Beach has done, and I applaud the initiatives they've taken. But the reality of it, in my view at least, as an engineer and as a builder, is that they are temporary bandages to the problem. I don't know if you've driven on West Avenue and Alton Road and Sunset, Harbor there, but these won't lie. The pumping will go only up to a certain point. And I have my views on what the ultimate solution are, and I'd be happy to explore them later. But let's continue the discussion here amongst our panelists.
And you brought up Miami Beach, which has really been the lab and getting a lot of attention for the work they're doing. So I think it would be a good point to kind of talk about, is Miami Beach doing a good job, in your opinion? Are they taking the right approach?
Well, I think I would defer to Jim on that.
Well, I know Commissioner Rodriguez is here from Doral, right? Did I see her earlier? Yeah, there she is. So I'm a county official, talking about cities is a precarious situation, but a lot of our cities are doing good work. Doral is doing excellent work in many of their things. The city of Miami Beach is a unique landform. It's a barrier island. Literally, it's not the mainland. It is a stretch of natural part of what was here over the years, and as we have advanced and developed it, we've changed its topography, and Aris was referring to that. So I think Miami Beach felt the need to move forward and demonstrate activity in the face of what we now call sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding. It comes during the high tide events. They know they're going to get flooding during storm surge of a hurricane, but literally to experience saltwater flooding on their streets during a non-climate event is disruptive to the kind of economy that we have built over the years on the beach. So they moved, they took action. Mayor Levine took the lead. They demonstrated some techniques in raising streets and doing pumps. But then they took a pause recently. Mayor Gelber came in and he said, let's make sure we're going in the right direction. And they brought in a national real estate group called Urban Land Institute, ULI, which also has a district council here in Southeast Florida. And they've conducted a study. And that study, they had an exit presentation about 2 weeks ago. And there'll be a full report. But generally, the experts said, congratulations on moving forward. Your actions are reflective of the threat and the vulnerability, but you need to broaden the way you think about this issue. And you need to sit back and look at some comprehensive ways of dealing with water. And folks, that's essentially what this is about. As Aris mentioned, 100 years ago, this place wasn't all that habitable until we started drainage and filling and other projects. We learned to live with the water. And that's exactly the ethic that we should take forward. We're going to have to learn to live with the water as it takes different forms and levels that we haven't experienced in the past.
Aris, would you like to add any to that?
Yeah, I followed what Miami Beach is doing, and I think it's a move in the right direction. And we've had a discussion, even at the county levels, say that, we can experiment with things, but we need to start talking about what is the long-term strategy. In other words, if you're building something for the long term, you've got to have some idea what the long-term blueprint is that you're building towards. And that discussion is just getting started here. Being porous, the underground, we can't do what the Dutch have done. We can't build dikes. We can't keep the water out by building walls, because the water is going to come from the ground up. It's going to come through the earth as the sea level rises. And as the sea level rises, even those western areas are going to see the hydrostatics, because we have essentially an underground river flowing from Lake Okeechobee through the Everglades toward the oceans. Primarily the Atlantic Ocean, but also the Gulf. So that hydrostatic difference is going to change. It's going to move up, which means there's going to be water in Doral. There's going to be water in Sunrise. There's going to be water, on all these developments there, because they're pretty low in elevation. So all these assumptions that we made are going to change. And what are we going to do about that?
Well, you preempted my next question, which was about Western cities and the Western areas. There's this idea that sea level rise is something that's just going to affect our coastal communities. But what you just said is that it's actually something that's going to affect all of South Florida, because we have this basically sponge underneath us and the water is coming up. And that's because the groundwater floats on top of the salty ocean water. And as sea levels rise, it's going to push that fresh groundwater that we use as our water supply right now, basically up through the ground. So thank you guys. So I wanted to, earlier we briefly talked about resiliency bonds and some other mechanisms. We're talking a lot about infrastructure, and something we didn't initially talk about before, but can you give us a little bit about resiliency bonds and ways that communities might think creatively about financing these things?
Yeah, so I think it's important when you think about sea level rise to have a basic understanding of the science behind it. So what's happening currently is the planet is heating up. There's no dispute that that's actually happening. There may be some dispute on why it's happening, but it's happening. The effects of that are threefold. As the planet starts to heat up, the oceans heat up. So naturally through that heat, the oceans are expanding in size due to the heat. You have Greenland, Antarctica. These are ice sheets that sit on top of the Earth mass. As those leak, or those melt, they leak into the ocean, which is rising the oceans as well. And then as you have greater evaporation, what happens is when we have rain, we're anticipating that you're going to have higher frequency and severity of rain into these areas. So like they touched on, from the insurance perspective, when we look at these different type of risks, most people think, okay, the biggest concern for us is going to be storm surge. We have a hurricane that comes in, and we have this massive wall of water that's going to inundate our areas. Well, that is a huge risk, but the chances of that major storm happening in any given year is basically about 1%. A larger risk exposure that we have is, like Aris had touched on, as we have tidal flooding. As the sea level rises, that water is going to come up through the water table, and your low-lying areas out west, you're going to see during high tide, the water is just going to come out of the ground. Well, that's going to affect a lot of properties and communities, and it's going to happen twice a day. And as this problem exponentially gets worse, those levels of sea level rise and tidal flooding are going to continue to get worse with that pattern. Thirdly, the other exposure, like we talked about, as we start to have rainstorms, those rainstorms are going to become more repetitive. The amount of rain that's going to fall is going to increase in its severity, which is going to cause also inland flooding. So those are really the three areas that the insurance industry is looking at: storm surge, tidal flooding, and repetitive rainfall. There are some challenges. How do we address this issue? You referenced the resilience bonds. They're relatively new in nature, but they're somewhat exciting for a local municipality. It's basically, you can go to the bond market, you get a bond basically to fund a certain infrastructure or engineering project. You'll have a modeling company that will come in that will look at that infrastructure project, and then it will be able to calculate what are the economic savings or the insurance savings from doing this infrastructure project. They can quantify that, and then when the investors get paid, they're willing to take a smaller coupon payout because the risk is mitigated due to that infrastructure project. So all local municipalities are finding challenges right now how to fund these infrastructure projects, whether they're getting federal dollars or state dollars or local dollars. So resiliency bonds is another tool in the toolbox that a lot of local municipalities are looking at right now to fund those infrastructure projects.
You've all talked about basically we need to do something. And one of the challenging topics and problems with sea level rise is not only do municipalities, governments need to address this problem and change, adapt public infrastructure, but individual homeowners are going, and property owners are going to have to adapt as well. So it's a top-down and bottom-up approach, and we have to figure out how they meet in the middle. So it's actually a very complex puzzle, and we've talked about this idea of living with water, and the cities are really embracing that. So can you each kind of give an example of either something a city can do now or has done, or a homeowner could do now that will kind of help with this long-term risk reduction?
Well, as you said, it's not, the government is not going to solve this for us totally. We've got to do something different. Talking here to commercial realty people, what do you tell a potential commercial buyer or lessor when he's looking at a ground floor store or whatever at an elevation of 2-3 feet? Right? What do you tell them? What advice do you give them? Or are you just going to be silent and just say, buyer beware, you do what you need to do? Because that's what we're really faced up with. Now, I'm seeing homes particularly, but also other buildings, commercial buildings that are being rebuilt today, are being built 2-3 feet higher. And actually, some of that is due to the county's new regulations, but some people are going even above that. I live near the bay. Fortunately, I moved to high ground, gave up life on the beach, not because I was worried about flooding, because I got tired of being there, but picked a location that was almost 15 feet elevation. And I said, I want to be here. Okay. I see my neighbors that are closer to the bay, new home being built, actually it's almost like 6-7 feet above the ground level, you know. So elevation to me at the private level, whether it's commercial or residential, is part of the solution here. Because the city and county may elevate the streets, but if you end up being like we're seeing in the west side of Miami Beach, your sidewalk and your storefront is 2-3 feet below the below the street level, what is going to happen in a flood? Okay, they'll tell you we have the pumps to pump it out, but believe me, pumps don't work all the time, you know. And if you're going to rely on pumps on a massive scale, to me that's not a sustainable solution. So we've got to think of all these things. You know, I like to tell people that I know, forget about the first floor. We may have to give up the first floor of high-rise buildings at some point, okay? So think about all these issues down the road.
I would add just one other point. You know, as a commercial realtor, I mean, you got to look at what your time horizon is. So this problem is continually going to get worse. If you look out 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, Miami-Dade County, Miami Beach is going to look dramatically different as you get further out on your time horizon. You guys are looking at my business today, what's going to happen over the next 5 years, 10 years, maybe 20 years as you're planning. I do agree, if I was going to invest into a commercial project in Miami-Dade County, I'm looking at the elevation. You know, I want to have a property that's at one of those highest elevation points. I don't see a situation where, you know, the commercial real estate market is going to have this huge disruption. I mean, if you even look at, you know, the stock market crash of 1920, as the stock market was crashing, even on that very day, there were still transactions. People were still selling stock on that day and people were still buying it. So as a commercial realtor, I don't see any scenario where over the next 20 years, you're not going to be able to sell commercial transactions.
Jim, do you want to give us a perspective kind of on a broader level?
Well, I don't think it's any, if you just look at Brickell City Center and see where the pedestrian activity has been built into at a level above the street, I mean, that's a design solution to new development, which we see happening throughout the community. What we have is a lot of legacy buildings and a lot of legacy projects that we have to work through those adjustments in our cities and throughout the county. And we recognize that happens best, frankly, after commercial transactions and when new buyers want to do redevelopment. That's the opportunity to incentivize different things that could be built in. I think that's areas the government's going to have to look to because we're not going to solve the problem by building just publicly owned infrastructure. We need to get the entire built landscape evolving to the changes as we see over the coming decades.
Great. So now we're going to get into the economics of sea level rise, how this is going to affect money. You know, in Florida, our community's dollars, so the money local governments receive, is based off of tax value, the taxable value of a property. So we've talked a little bit about people, although we really haven't seen it yet, that sea level rise will affect property value and that ultimately maybe higher ground might be more valuable. So this means that cities are going to have to cope potentially with a reduction in their taxable revenue. In addition, you want to make sure that you protect your investment long term and thinking about things like how flood insurance might change over the long term as well. So to start us off, Aris, can you start with a broad overview of how you see the fiscal dimension of sea level rise, how the markets see this, and then we'll let our other panelists chime in as well?
Well, I think it's early days here. You know, markets tend to prolong the status quo. That's why we have kind of upset changes, in markets. And markets work efficiently when there's good information. Markets need information to work efficiently. And today we don't have that kind of information flowing openly. There's pockets of information. There's decision makers who are kind of early movers, let's say. But really the, general public, the, general community is not really incorporated that. Valuation models are historically driven. They're kind of, backward mirror type driven. So, all the valuation analysis that's done today, is based on history. It's not based on what's coming. So that's why markets get surprised sometimes, because, the inertia gets up to a certain point and then everybody wakes up and there's a shift, there's an abrupt shift. And that's what worries me the most, let's say, that we're going to want to prolong the status quo, and there's going to be an abrupt shift at some point. A much more, I think, palatable situation will be, let's get more information out there. For me, elevation information is one of the primary things, and I enjoy talking to realty friends of mine and say, why don't you just put the elevation in the ad listing along with number of bedrooms, bedrooms, rooms, elevation. Why don't you just do that? And there's kind of a fear of doing that, in the industry and so forth. Bad news doesn't sell, right? Scaring people doesn't sell. But a uninformed consumer will at some point become a scared consumer, and you don't want that to happen. You don't want panic to step in. So I think the whole we're in an information phase, and you are part of this information, flow here. That's why I think it's, great that you've invited this panel, that you're, thinking about this, learning about this, because you're at the front line of communicating this. You may have a commercial customer that you want to develop for the long term. It's not just a one-shot, one-transaction deal. You want that commercial customer to come to you repeatedly and to say, yeah, you helped me make the right choices, and I'm happy with what I bought or what I leased and so forth. And that requires for you to be educated on this trend, and be able to be a partner with that customer. Whether you're on the buy side or the sell side. On the sell side, there may be someone who's, on an excellent piece of property that's very resilient, that's, going to resist flooding, and you want them to get the best value for what they're offering, and not to price it low, So, whether you're selling or buying, I think, information and how you communicate that and collaborate with your customers is going to be very important. So, the information phase is where we're at right now.
And personally, I've actually seen the opposite of what most people think, and that when we come in and a realtor asks us to help them, it's actually helped the sale, because the homeowner or potential buyer has been skeptical and saying, oh, I'm concerned this house is on the water, but being able to provide them with the information and say, hey, actually, you're pretty okay for the next 20 to 30 years in terms of sea level rise, and here's some easy things that you can do to adapt your home in 15, 20 years. Oh, okay, I only have to save a couple $1,000 a year to do some adaptation action and protect my home or property long term. It's actually been a selling point for certain properties, and I'd love to get your thoughts on the insurance side.
Add on the economics. Local governments derive their revenues from property taxes. So you want to have the most amount of people paying in property taxes at the highest amount to increase those revenues. So there is going to be a time where certain areas are going to be less viable than others. But as those areas become less viable, all that's going to do is shift other areas to become more viable, where the demand is going to increase and those properties are actually going to get more valuable. So you kind of have an inverse relationship. While you may lose, some areas off the tax roll, you're going to have other areas that are going to be highly valued. So again, it's not a lose-lose. There's kind of a trade-off there.
You want to go to questions? You want to go to questions?
We're going to, in just a moment, yeah, absolutely. We're going to open it up so you guys can ask questions in just a moment. What I want to make sure, though, I want to get Paul to talk a little bit about insurance before we open it up to question, and talk about the outlook of insurance and whether or not the insurance industry has the capacity to handle sea level rise.
Sure. So how many people in this room lived here when we had Hurricane Andrew? Okay, a good amount of you. So historically, when you look at how the insurance industry would operate, they used to just save premiums, they put it in a bucket, and they hope when the next natural disaster happens that there's enough dollars in that bucket to be able to pay claims, and then that we don't have another catastrophe for a certain amount of years to replenish the bucket. Well, we learned after Hurricane Andrew, we ran out of money in that bucket fairly quickly, and we had a lot of insolvencies within the market. That kind of precipitated a new way of thinking about insurance, which kind of shifted us to reinsurance. So basically what reinsurance is an insurance company will purchase insurance in the fact that we wind up having a major catastrophe, that they can get reimbursed a certain amount of their losses from this reinsurance company. Also from that point after Andrew, we started seeing all these modeling companies that would come in to do a better job to determine what is the actual risk exposure. If we have a category 4 or a category 5 that comes into Miami, what is the actual losses going to be? So we have more certainty from the insurance company's perspective to say, okay, we know what we have to charge. We know what type of reinsurance that we need to purchase so that we can make it through the catastrophe without having an insolvency. So we've done a good job. We've gotten to the point right now where there's a ton of capacity. You see reinsurance companies competing against each other, lots of innovative products, resiliency bonds, insurance-linked securities. There's a lot of appetite out in the private reinsurance market to insure these type of risks, which has actually drawn down the premium costs quite a bit in the state of Florida. While you may see insurance premiums rise, you'd be surprised that what's really keeping them from rising even higher is this competitive nature within the private reinsurance market. So I always believe that there's going to be in the future plenty of insurance to insure these type of risks. So if you're in Miami Beach and sea level's rising and you have a commercial property, you're going to be able to find insurance. The question is, how much is it going to cost? There's this move now, even with the National Flood Insurance Program and with the modeling, they can tell you pretty much at a micro level, at the location of that property, what the risk is and what it should cost. Unfortunately, while the capacity is there, there's an affordability issue. So will those commercial structures be able to afford what it would cost to actually be on Miami Beach or some of these other high-risk zones? But as far as insurance being available, yes, we foresee plenty of capacity into the future.
So I'm a big fan of leaving people with tools. So before we open it up to question, I do know Aris has one tool in his hand, and I'd love for people to know about it and read a little bit about it. And I'd also like to let you guys know about a website called Flood IQ at www.floodiq.org. You can type in any address in the state of Florida, and it'll give you basically a risk overview for flood risk and sea level rise. And you can actually download a report for that particular property for free. It's a national nonprofit, so it's a great tool to go in and learn a little bit about the flood risk of particular areas and properties. Yeah. And Aris, you want to tell us a little bit about it?
I don't call this a tool. It's a white paper that FIU issued, and you can find it at FIU's Sea Level Solutions website. And I'm a co-author of one of the sections in here. But it's basically outlines the risk and opportunities of climate change for the top business sectors in Southeast Florida. So it talks about, let's say, the top 5 business areas in Southeast Florida, and property, real estate is one of the biggest ones, and kind of outlines ideas for the future. So I recommend you go online and just briefly read through this so you're familiar with some of the ideas that are being put on the table for discussion.
The county maintains a lot of websites, but the one that has our repository of studies and other tools that can be used in this area is miamidade.gov/green. And if you go to miamidade.gov/green, you will see just a lineup of PDF files and other things that you can use, and it's updated on a regular basis.
And so with that, we can open it up to questions, and hopefully you guys have some good ones for our panel. But let me just repeat the question to make sure everyone heard it. So what's going to drive the changes that we're going to see, the actual action that we're going to see?
Mitigation. In the state of Florida, we have wind mitigation discounts, which are currently for, property insurance. If you do certain wind mitigation projects to your structure, you get a reduction in your insurance premium. I see that moving forward as we have sea level rise, you start to have the same type of programs for flooding. Currently, they don't have wind mitigation discounts for flood, but you're starting to see a transition now where the state of Florida is allowing private insurers to insure flood risk, where historically that's been through the National Flood Insurance Program. And as that industry winds up becoming more privatized, I think you're going to see private reinsurance companies saying, yes, if you mitigate this structure and show us that it's going to be more resilient, we will give you a rebate on your insurance premium. That's a trend that we're seeing.
And I would say on the commercial side, FEMA does already have measures you can take to get reductions in your flood insurance policies. And that's fairly robust. There's companies that can go out there and help you figure out how to take measures that will reduce your flood insurance premium.
Yeah, I would add that the county government engages through the Beacon Council, our economic development organization. We engage the reinsurance industry also to try to understand what actions we can take or to make sure they're aware of the things we are doing that can affect two things. One, the risk assessment that is made at the private level, but importantly for us, our bond ratings for municipal bonds. So our actions are geared towards trying to send the right signals to the reinsurance markets that we are engaged in a comprehensive approach. We don't have all the answers to all the problems that can be posed by some of the extrapolation of some of the science things we've been talking about, but we are committed to an ongoing engagement. We work with our universities a lot, and we bring in experts from around the world, and we hope that that forms the basis for more predictability by people who are making investments and by those who invest in our municipal bonds, that they'll have the same level of assurity.
Yes, sir. Sure. So the questions were, how far in advance should you look in terms of sea level rise for a property if you're doing new construction? And the second is, how do you foresee flood insurance changing, and will it be a requirement? So why don't we tackle the flood insurance one first?
Yeah. So currently right now, through the National Flood Insurance Program, they have different maps depending on which zone that you're in. As sea level rises, obviously those zones are going to expand. If you have a federally backed mortgage or a federally backed commercial mortgage, you're going to be required to have flood insurance. And I would imagine even private lenders, as the risk exposure increases, that they're going to require you to have flood coverage as well. So that's going to be a big expense. That's something that you really need to take into account, because that cost is not only the cost today, but that cost will increase over the next 5, 10, 20 years. So you might want to budget for that. I would say, as far as picking a parcel of land that you're going to build in, I guess you need to really, depends on your time horizon on how long you plan on keeping that property or what the use is for. But if you have long-term goals for that property, I would look for the higher elevation areas, and then obviously do whatever mitigation to the current, at least at a minimum to the current building codes, and maybe even go higher.
Yeah, I've kind of extracted from all the projections and stuff that I've read, and I have a rule of thumb basically. I mean, if you're looking to build something new, I would say you want to be at least at a 10-foot elevation on your ground floor, at least, going forward. Now, you may build, to that elevation, and everything around you is pretty low. So I have a second rule of thumb that says you want to know what the elevation is of the route from your property to the closest interstate entrance. Because interstates on the road system are typically built to the highest standards, and typically are elevated more than all the other roads. So, if you want to be thorough, look at both aspects of your choices.
One of the things we're doing with our county-owned assets is we're conducting what I call a stress test on the assets, because we wanted to be sure that as we go through our annual capital improvements planning for all the different infrastructure that we're responsible for, that we're thinking of the worst case scenario. And so our stress test right now is 3 feet of sea level rise, and on top of that, a Category 5 storm surge. That's a significant event. It's not going to happen very often, and the 3 feet of sea level rise is decades ahead of us. But some of the infrastructure we're building is meant to be there for decades. So we are building that in. When you go through that stress test, a significant number of our infrastructure is going to not fall in the category of critical. The other aspect of that test is not just its vulnerability, but whether or not that asset needs to be back online immediately after an event. So a park has a relatively low criticality score. The airport has the highest.
And I would also add that when you're looking long-term, you shouldn't just look at sea level rise as an elevation, from an elevation standpoint. You should think about things like the stormwater capacity around that property as well. There's a lot that goes into thinking long-term about a property, and this is something we kind of do on a daily basis. But also, very importantly, Aris talked about making sure it's elevated. We should also think about potential adaptability. So maybe today you really can't be at 10 feet because all of the infrastructure is at 5, but what you can do is build that building in a way that you can raise that finished floor over time and think about the foundation over time so that maybe you build for today, but you really plan for tomorrow in your buildings. So I want to thank you all for having us here today. Our contact information is in your program that you all received if you'd like to follow up with any questions. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Paul. Thank you.